A priest in exile sits by an irrigation canal outside Babylon, and the sky rips open over a country that thinks it owns the future. That canal is the Kibar near Nippur. The year is 593 BCE. By modern reconstruction, the 5th day of the 4th month, which lands around late July. A storm cloud rolls in from the north, not just thunder and rain, but something alive. 4 living beings shimmer like burnished metal, straight-legged, winged, faces like a lion, an ox, an eagle, a man. Wheels intersect wheels, rims full of eyes, moving without turning. A sapphire throne blazes above them, and fire coils within wheels like a heartbeat. The exiles left everything behind in 597 BCE when Nebuchadnezzar II uprooted Judah's elites, but the God of Israel refuses to stay behind. The mobile throne chariot arrives in Babylon, and Ezekiel, son of Buzi, learns in one vision that the presence of the Holy One outruns empires. That first shock sets the tone. Ezekiel's book reads like layered thunder. Every dateline clicks into place like a drumbeat. 5th year, 7th year, 9th year, 10th year, 12th year, 25th year of exile. This is not one blurred memory. This is a time-stamped eruption of history and heaven interlocked. The exiles in Tel Aviv by the Kibar have one story about themselves. They were unlucky. They were victims of geopolitics. They were on pause until Judah gets back on its feet. Ezekiel receives a hammer blow of a counter-story. Jerusalem's corruption has ripened. Babylon is not the glitch. Babylon is the instrument. He eats a scroll. He literally consumes the message, and it tastes like honey even though it is covered with laments and woes. Then he goes silent. For long stretches he is locked by the word of God, tongue glued to the roof of his mouth, unless he receives a command to speak. He is appointed a watchman, not because he sits on a wall with a horn, though he will act like it, but because his task becomes surgical. He must cut through national denial with razor-honest visions and enactments. The people say they are safe because the temple is in Jerusalem. Ezekiel shows a God who rides a storm throne outside city limits. Their defense collapses in one image. The drama sweeps from his hut into the streets through sign acts that scream louder than speeches. He sets up a mud brick model of Jerusalem, lays siege, works around it, and leans an iron pan between himself and the city, as if he is God refusing to look. Then he lies on his left side 390 days for Israel's guilt, on his right 40 days for Judah's guilt, day for year. He bakes barley cakes over fuel fit for unclean rations to mirror famine rations during the siege. He shaves his head and beard with a sword, weighs the hair, and divides it into thirds. 1/3 burns in the city, 1/3 is struck with the sword, 1/3 scatters to the wind, and a few strands he tucks into his garment. The audience does not miss the point. He digs through a wall with his belongings, as if sneaking out in the dark, acting out the flight of the last king. Finally, the blow nobody forgets. His brilliant-eyed wife dies suddenly, and he is told to keep his face steady and not perform the customary mourning. Jerusalem will fall, and the survivors will stagger without the capacity to cry. The chronology marches toward the disaster that reshapes Israel's map. 597 BCE, for the first deportation under Jehoiachin. Zedekiah, installed by Babylon as a vassal king back in Jerusalem. False comfort warms the city with talk of Egyptian help and divine protection. Ezekiel receives, in the 6th year of exile, a vision that explains why the temple cannot act like a firewall. In that vision he is transported to Jerusalem, right into the temple courts. He sees elders in secret chambers honoring creeping things and abominable images. Women weep for Tammuz, the dying god of Mesopotamian myth, not the creator of Israel. 25 men bow to the sun with their backs to the temple. The denunciation is more surgical than angry. The house has become a shrine to borrowed power. The temple is treated like a good luck charm that allows people to store idols under their beds and still expect protection. The most terrible moment unfolds quietly. The glory that once filled Solomon's temple moves, first to the threshold, then to the east gate, then above the city to the Mount of Olives. The throne chariot that arrived in Babylon departs Jerusalem. The temple will not be defended. It has been abandoned. That departure is not just theology. It becomes history in 586 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar's forces breach the city, torch the temple, and tear down the walls. Ezekiel's date lines track the drumbeat before and after. 9th year, 10th day, 10th month, the siege begins. 12th year, 10th month, 5th day. A refugee reaches the exiles with news of the fall, and Ezekiel's mouth opens. The prophet who could not cry at his wife's death receives back his voice, and the message pivots. Judgment is not the last word. The same mobility that carried glory out of the temple will carry it back. A God who can leave can also return. The engine of hope revs up exactly where the engine of doom winds down. The fallout extends beyond Judah. Ezekiel issues oracles against a ring of nations that encircled Israel with taunts and knives. Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia. The tone targets opportunism and hatred more than geography. Edom in particular is confronted for taking advantage of disaster, and later memories of Edom's gloating over Jerusalem will fuel bitterness that lasts centuries. Then the oracles turn seaward and skyward to two powers everyone could see and fear, Tyre and Egypt. Tyre gleams in Ezekiel's language like a merchant ship made of expensive cedars, sails dyed blue and purple, benches of ivory, boards inlaid with every luxury product from Tarshish to Dedan. The lament for Tyre in chapter 27 reads like an inventory of the ancient world. Silver, iron, tin, lead, ivory, ebony, turquoise, embroidered garments, wheat of Minnith, balm, honey, oil, and resin. Ezekiel's poetry moves like the surf around a fortress island city that mastered trade and outlasted kings. Then he hears a word that aims like a hammer. Tyre exalted itself at Jerusalem's fall, and God says the sea wall will not stand forever. Nations will come up like waves. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, will batter Tyre for many years. History reports a 13-year siege starting around 586 BCE. The king gains little spoil because the people retreat to their island redoubt. Ezekiel records that God grants Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar as wages because his head was rubbed bare and his army worked without pay against Tyre. The accuracy is sharp. A siege that drains Babylon and yields no treasure. Then the earlier words about Tyre widen out. Many nations will come like waves, and they will scrape her stones, timber, and dust, and toss them into the water. Centuries later, Alexander the Great arrives in 332 BCE with an appetite for impossible engineering. He builds a causeway from the mainland to island Tyre, a half-mile mole of rubble heaped into the sea. The old city's stones and dust become roadwork. Tyre falls. Ezekiel's words about stones and timbers in the water becomes street-level literal. The cascade continues. Fishermen spread nets on the bare rock where Tyre once boasted. The prophecy composes history in movements, and the movements deliver. Babylon sees without plunder. Later waves, finishing what the first could not. The prophet speaks to his century and beyond it, without losing either. Egypt's oracles push into controversy with the same unflinching precision. Pharaoh Hophra, known to Greek historians as a Prius, is confronted for his pride. The Nile turns Egypt into a garden by default, and the pharaoh claims the river is his. God answers through Ezekiel, "The reed staff that breaks every hand that leans on it will splinter Judah again." Nebuchadnezzar's campaign against Egypt in 568-567 BCE is noted in Babylonian chronicles. The length and effect in Egypt remain debated because the Pharaoh's scribes were not motivated to record humiliation. Ezekiel speaks of a 40-year desolation and scattering. Scholars run numbers against Persian-era records, Elephantine papyri, and archaeological layers. Some read the 40 as a measured symbol of wilderness judgment drawn from Israel's own 40. Others see a period of heavy decline and depopulation that need not erase every settlement. What cannot be scrubbed from the timeline is simple. Nebuchadnezzar marched into Egypt. Oprah lost his throne. Herodotus reports that his successor, Amasis, ultimately killed him, possibly by strangulation. Ezekiel had announced that the arm of Egypt would be broken and not healed. The precision is uncomfortable for the proud. It still stands. After the last wall in Jerusalem collapsed, Ezekiel's entire tone shifts from surgical judgment to generative hope. The hinge swings on a single arrival. In the 12th year of exile, news of the city's fall reaches the community on the Kebar, and Ezekiel's mouth opens. He repeats and reframes his calling as a watchman because the shape of danger has changed. The enemy outside the walls already did its work. Now the deadliest threat lies within the heart. Israel insists on a proverb about sour grapes that excuses present guilt with ancestral bitterness. Ezekiel disassembles the proverb. The soul that sins will die. The righteous who turns from righteousness and embraces injustice will not be covered by yesterday's record. The wicked who turns from wickedness and does what is right will live under mercy. This is not an abstract theology lecture. This is the prophet cutting a path forward for a people who lost their city and their story. He announces a God who takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but delights to see them turn and live. Then Ezekiel delivers an earthquake of a metaphor for leadership. The shepherds of Israel have been feeding themselves and ignoring the flock. God says he will become the shepherd. He will search for the lost, bind up the injured, strengthen the weak, feed them with justice. He will judge between fat sheep and lean sheep, between rams and goats. He will set up one shepherd over them, his servant David. This is not a backward glance. David is long dead. Ezekiel points forward to a coming ruler in David's line who will rule not as a predator but as a keeper. The covenant of peace is announced. Wild beasts no longer devour them. Showers of blessing fall in season. The land becomes like Eden again. The river of hope then opens into architecture. In the 25th year of exile, 14 years after the city fell, Ezekiel is transported to a very high mountain in a vision. He meets a radiant man, whose appearance shines like bronze. The man carries a cord and a reed that measures 6 long cubits, about 3 meters, and begins to measure a temple complex larger and cleaner than any Ezekiel has seen with his eyes. Gates face north, south, east, with steps and vestibules and guard rooms of precise dimensions. Courtyards unfold in squares. Chambers line the edges. The altar sits at the center, like a mount within a mount. The prophet walks with the measuring figure, counting the widths of thresholds and the heights of walls. It reads like blueprints set to poetry. Then, the surprise Ezekiel's generation needed more than any perfect angle. The glory returns. The sound of the coming is like the roar of rushing waters, and the earth shines with the radiance. The glory that left by the east returns by the east. The east gate is then shut. This gate becomes, in Ezekiel's world, a theological headline in stone. The entrance of the divine presence sets a seal. Ordinary traffic does not resume there. Scholars and worshippers wrestle with the sacrifices described in these chapters. Burnt offerings, sin offerings, grain offerings, new moons and Sabbaths and festivals pulse through this vision of days to come. Some read a literal temple for a future age in Israel's story, with memorial sacrifices that never compete with the finality of divine forgiveness, but commemorate and catechize. Others read the entire complex as visionary symbolism, a massive temple language proclamation that holiness will return to the center of Israel's life and spread outward. Ezekiel is not flattening the future into reduced ritual. He is expanding holiness into a city where the name of the city becomes, "The Lord is there." That trickle becomes a torrent. In the final movement of temple imagery, water begins flowing from the threshold of the house, eastward, past the altar, down and out. Ezekiel is measured along the flow, 1,000 cubits to ankle depth, another 1,000 to knees, another 1,000 to waist, another 1,000, and the stream becomes a river that cannot be crossed. The geography is not random. The water runs down toward the Dead Sea, a basin so salty that nothing swim-sized lives in it. And yet Ezekiel sees fish species as abundant as in the Great Sea. He sees fishermen spreading nets along the shore. He sees trees on both sides of the river, leaves that do not wither, fruit that never fails, fruit for food and leaves for healing. The imagery ties directly to Eden and stretches forward to the last page of Scripture, where a river flows from the throne of God, and the leaves heal the nations. Ezekiel is driving hope down into the dirt. Land divisions for the 12 tribes are laid out with fairness. The alien who sojourns among Israel and has children gets an inheritance, because the boundaries of belonging are being remapped by grace. The very name of the city finalizes the point. The Lord is there. Not all his images are gentle. Ezekiel's greatest spectacle of resurrection rises in chapter 37. He is set in a valley of dry bones, bleached and disconnected, an image of Israel after national ruin. He prophesies as commanded. A rattling starts. Bones. Bind bones. Sinews knit. Flesh covers. Breath, the wind spirit of God enters. And they stand as an exceedingly great army. The interpretation is spelled out in the vision itself. The bones are the whole house of Israel, speaking in despair that their bones are dried up and their hope cut off. God opens graves and brings them up out of exile, places them back in their land, and places his spirit within, so they live. In the same chapter, Ezekiel performs another enacted parable. 2 sticks, one labeled for Judah and the sons of Israel associated with Judah, one for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel associated with him. He joins them in his hand, and they become one stick. The meaning is unambiguous. The division of the kingdom will end. One king, a shepherd in David's line, will rule them. One law, one sanctuary in their midst, forever. The historical run-up offers partial fulfillment and stokes impatience for more. Cyrus of Persia topples Babylon in 539 BCE and issues a decree the next year that releases exiles. Waves of return begin. Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor rebuild the altar and lay a temple foundation. Prophets Haggai and Zechariah stir hearts. Ezra and Nehemiah lead later phases of restoration, rebuild walls, and renew covenant. The people are back in the land, a remnant with a modest temple that never touches the old glory. The 10 tribes remain scattered and mixed, and Judah's post-exilic community tries to hold identity under foreign crowns. Ezekiel's 2-stick vision leans forward. Centuries pass and the longing lengthens. In the modern era, a return movement reconstitutes a Jewish homeland and revives a language. Ezekiel's words echo through the headlines, without turning contemporary politics into prophecy flashcards. The prophet's core claim refuses to shrink. God can reassemble what history reduces to bones. He can heal divisions that humans treat as permanent features of the landscape. He can breathe on graves and call a future into being. The next seismic prophecy pours out of chapters 38 and 39. A leader named Gog, from the land of Magog, chief of Meshech and Tubal, is summoned like a storm. Allies rally from Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Beth Togarmah, a coalition from the far north and from the ends of the map. The target is a land restored from war, gathered from many peoples, dwelling securely. Gog ascends like a cloud to cover the land. God's response is catastrophic for the invader. An earthquake shakes mountains into rubble. pestilence and torrential rains fall. Hailstones, fire, and sulfur consume armies. Soldiers turn swords against each other. The cleanup takes months. Bones are buried in a valley that gets a name, Hamon-Gog, the horde of Gog, and the land is cleansed. Weapons are burned for years, serving as fuel. Carrion birds and wild beasts are summoned to the sacrificial feast of a fallen army. Shen vengeance is described not to revel in gore, but to establish a point that runs through all Ezekiel. God acts to sanctify his name among nations, and to teach his own people again that he is the Lord. This vision brims with ancient names that link to the Table of Nations in Genesis, and to peoples in Anatolia and the steppe. Magog evokes a phalange of northern tribes. Meshech and Tubal point toward regions in Asia Minor. Gomer and Togarmah point toward areas associated with Cimmerians and peoples in the Armenian highlands. Persia and Cush and Put widen the theater to the east and south and west. Some readers lock the prophecy into a specific ancient incursion. Others treat it as a composite picture of all the north-born threats Israel endured, from Assyria to later invaders, a summary defeat of every storm at once. Many in later generations hear this passage as an end-of-days scenario, and the New Testament book of Revelation cites Gog and Magog to represent a final, worldwide rebellion that God puts down at the end of the millennium. Ezekiel's language leaves room for layered fulfillment, because the goal does not shift with the dates. The point remains the same. Israel's restoration is not fragile. Its safety rests on a God who flips invading coalitions into examples of his holiness and a stage for his mercy. That mercy lands in Ezekiel's core messages on personal responsibility and newness. Chapter 18 stands like a pillar. The exiles in Babylon carry their fathers' sins like a backpack they did not choose. Ezekiel answers by drawing a line between guilt and legacy that no proverb can blur. A father who eats sour grapes does not make his child's teeth set on edge by moral force. A righteous man who walks in justice lives. A violent son who sheds blood dies. A wicked son who sees his father's crimes, refuses to imitate them, and practices justice and righteousness will not die for the guilt of his father. Each individual faces God directly, without excuse, and without inherited penalty for another's crimes. Then the prophet goes deeper. He reveals the only way this accounting becomes life and not a spreadsheet of terror. God promises a new heart and a new spirit. He will take out the heart of stone and give a heart of flesh. He will put his spirit within and cause his people to walk in his statutes. The dynamic shifts from external compliance to internal transformation. The law does not change. The engine that runs the law does. Ezekiel's words register like a deep chord that later writers hear and amplify, not least in Jeremiah's New Covenant and in the promise of the Spirit poured out. The intensity of Ezekiel's book never fades. Even his harshest allegories carry surgical precision aimed at healing what they cut. The parable of the 2 eagles and a cedar in chapter 17 lays out Judah's politics without naming names at first. One great eagle with broad wings uproots the top of a cedar and carries it to a land of traders, which is plainly Babylon taking Jehoiachin. A seed planted by the stream grows into a low vine. The vine reaches toward a second eagle, clearly Egypt, and breaks its loyalty, namely Zedekiah's rebellion. The result is inevitable. The vine will not thrive when shifted by hot eastern winds. The allegory ends with a countermove of grace. God plants a tender twig on a high and lofty mountain, and it becomes a noble cedar where every bird finds shelter. The politics of palace betrayal is not the final layer. Restoration rides above it. Another image digs into Jerusalem's spiritual infidelity with painful detail. The allegory of Oholah and Oholibah in chapter 23 portrays Samaria and Jerusalem as sisters who lust after foreign powers and bring ruin upon themselves by their alliances and idolatry. The language is searing and careful at once. Ezekiel shocks his listeners out of numbness because the normal vocabulary of sin and repentance failed to pierce their defenses. This is not sensational for effect. This is triage for a dying city. Ezekiel's date stamps keep teaching long after the visions pass. The opening call inside the storm cloud falls in 593 BCE. The idolatries in the temple are exposed in 5902. The elders consult Ezekiel in 591 and receive history told from God's view, from Egypt to the wilderness to the land. In the 9th year, 588 BCE, the pot begins to boil in Jerusalem. By the 11th year, 586, the city burns, and Ezekiel receives oracles against Tyre and Sidon. In the 12th year, 585, the refugee arrives with the fall news. In the 27th year of exile, which is 571 BCE, Ezekiel receives the strange wage declaration that God gives Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar in compensation for the bruising siege of Tyre. The prophet's careful dates match the stride of Babylonian and later Persian chronicles often enough to satisfy the most skeptical timeline readers. This is a man who walked with a calendar in one hand and fire in the other. No prophet exposes the mechanics of exile like Ezekiel. He shows how exile unplugs a people from their false sacred geography and forces the question of presence. His opening vision declared a truth that the exile coded into their daily life. The glory rides, the presence travels. The God of Sinai Zion is not imprisoned by a house of stone. Ezekiel shatters the fatal confusion between symbol and presence, then rebuilds a future where symbol and presence meet cleanly again. That explains why everything he does with architecture and sacrifice in the later chapters vibrates with intent. He is not a priest trapped in outdated ritual fantasy. He is a priest who saw the glory come and go and come again. Part of Ezekiel's genius lies in the way he uses senses. He eats the scroll. He lies still on one side until his bones ache. He feels the cords that bind him. He tastes ration bread baked over impure fuel. He shaves with a sword, not a razor, so the sound and danger dig in. These acts translate divine speech into embodied memory for a people who can ignore words, but not a man lying in public day after day. Even his silence functions as theater. The mute watchman who suddenly speaks when the city falls does not need to explain the meaning. The very opening of his mouth becomes the sermon. His treatment of the temple's defilement and the glory's departure remains one of the most staggering pieces of prophetic literature, not because of the fireworks, but because of the diagnosis. People trusted a place. God withdrew because trust in the place covered a rupture with the person. The vision where a man in linen marks the foreheads of those who sigh over abominations before the city's destruction reads like a counter-Passover, a remnant sealed amid judgment. The mark takes the shape of the last Hebrew letter, Tav, in ancient script once drawn as a cross-like sign. The detail is ancient and earthy at once, and never leaves the interpretive tradition. The oracles against shepherds, the return of glory, the river that heals, the two sticks that become one, the destruction of Gog, all circle one center. God acts to make his name known. Ezekiel repeats the purpose line like a chorus. Then they will know that I am the Lord. He says it over Israel, and over Ammon, and Moab, and Edom, and Philistia, and Tyre, and Sidon, and Egypt. He says it about the remnant who keep covenant in agony, and about invaders who boast over ruins. He says it about dry bones, and about a prince who eats bread in the east gate. Ezekiel's future is not a garden detached from its gardener. The daily ground is holy ground, because the gardener lives there. Even Ezekiel's technical notes preach. The long cubit he uses for the temple measurements is vivid and precise, a cubit and a handbreadth. He explains it so the reader does not mismeasure the holy court. The prince, in the restored temple, has an intriguing place. He is not the high priest, nor is he a nondescript official. He offers certain sacrifices. He enters by the vestibule of the gate, not by the gate proper, because the glory entered there and sealed it. He receives land on both sides of the holy allotment and is warned never to oppress the people by seizing their inheritance. The priesthood is purified. Sons of Zadok remain faithful while others who went astray bear shame and serve in lesser roles. The flow of holiness reverses pollution. In old temple rules, a dead body's touch carries impurity outward. In Ezekiel's vision, the temple's presence sends life outward, even turning the Dead Sea sweet. The weight Ezekiel puts on individual responsibility never removes communal reality. He names systemic violence and predation with relentless specificity. Princes are told to stop driving the people out of their allotments. Merchants who cheat with false balances are called out. Bloodshed and idolatry are linked as twin cancers. Prophets who whitewash cracked walls are exposed as dangerous liars who build a veneer over structural collapse. The women who practice occult manipulation are accused of hunting souls and selling illusions for barley bread. These details read like news bulletins, because they name how injustice actually works. Then Ezekiel insists again, a life can still turn. Responsibility cuts both ways. Everyone can repent. No one can coast on another's integrity. The fall of Jerusalem rattles the exiles and the nations. Judah's enemies assume permanent eclipse. Ezekiel refuses to compose elegies for Israel's end. He composes blueprints instead. He hears the march of empires and places them under a voice that does not tremble. He names Nebuchadnezzar as God's servant in certain tasks and then predicts the limits of his reach. He exposes Pharaoh's crocodile swagger and promises a hook in the jaws that drags the monster onto dry land. He calls Tyre's beauty by name and still describes the wave that will rip its harbor apart. Ezekiel refuses to be impressed, even when he uses imagery filled with awe. He is awed in the right direction. The way Ezekiel's prophecies land in history keeps drawing readers. The siege he described with a brick becomes the siege that forged a new Judaism. The 13-year grind against Tyre ends without spoil, exactly as noted, and is followed by Egypt as wages. The causeway over the sea and the latter ruins of Tyre read like Ezekiel's phrases turned into a photograph. Pharaoh Hophra's downfall and Amosis's rule line up with the oracle that the arms of Egypt would be broken. The temple's loss in 5286 BCE tracks with Ezekiel's vision of the departing presence. The return under Cyrus matches the skeleton of the valley coming to life, even if Ezekiel's full-body vision still leans forward for many. The most arresting alignments keep rippling. Interpreters from the Second Temple period to late antiquity to modern scholarship argue detail and timing, but Ezekiel's placements keep finding purchase. His influence bends across centuries beyond history books. Ezekiel's Merkava, the throne chariot, anchors Jewish mystical literature that explores the chariot's levels in quest for wisdom. His river shapes hymns and prayers. His watchman metaphor frames pastoral and prophetic responsibility for communities that sit under pressure. His new heart and new spirit language becomes a key in New Testament writers' hands. His dry bones vision pours into art and liturgy and hope lines spoken at gravesides. The words that once rang in a refugee camp by a canal now ring across languages and oceans, because they describe a God who travels into exile with his people and carries them back with a new engine inside. The shape of Ezekiel's book suggests an engineered ark. Chapters 124 carry judgment on Judah and Jerusalem while the city still stands. Chapters 25 to knock down the neighbors who thought Judah's fall proved the universe had changed gods. Chapter 33 pivots with the watchman's mouth reopening. Chapters 34-39 build hope with shepherd language, new heart promises, national resurrection, and the crushing of the last northern threat. Chapters 40-48 Place a hardware store, stack of measuring rods, onto a field of longing. The ark is comprehensive. No loose end dangles without an address. Idolatry, injustice, false comfort, predatory leadership, national pride, international arrogance, despair, paralysis, and the need for a real presence all receive their treatment. Even small lines bear weight. The east gate remains shut after the glory enters. The prince eats bread in the vestibule. The waters multiply fish species along the shore of the Dead Sea, but the swamps and marshes are left for salt. The strangers receive inheritance among Israel's tribes. The priests wear linen, not wool, to avoid sweat in the sanctuary, because sweat symbolizes human effort intruding on holy service. The prophet records that the Lord will be a sanctuary for a little while during exile, a phrase that soothed the nation without a temple and built a new understanding of presence that could travel the Lord as a portable sanctuary. That line alone could carry a generation. Ezekiel's hardest sign reverberates beyond one marriage. The command not to mourn his wife makes sense only in the light of his role as sign. The city he loves will fall in a way that breaks normal grief structures. The people will sit stunned, unable to wail, their faces frozen. Ezekiel, living that silence ahead of them, becomes a preface to their future. He does not cheapen his grief. He writes it into the story, so the story will hold a place for every person whose tears ran dry in disaster. The depth of Ezekiel's pronouncements about glory and holiness peels back layers of the ancient question of how a holy God lives with a profane people. The answer he gives is not retreat. The answer is renovation. Presence withdraws when abused. Presence returns to a house rebuilt to fit the presence. The walls bear dimensions that shout separation and purification, not to keep people out, but to keep presence uncontaminated and then spread life outward. The altar is consecrated with a week of offerings. The Levites who wandered are restored to lesser service in shame, and the faithful sons of Zadok are given the inner priestly tasks. Holiness is not an electric field. Holiness is a moral and relational environment that heals when the architecture of community aligns with the God who enters it. The ending of Ezekiel lands on a name rather than a date. The Lord is there, a city named by a promise rather than a king, a map partitioned by justice, a river that heals the deadest sea on earth, a gate sealed by the memory of returning glory, a people shepherded by God and by a prince from David's line, a witness to the nations that once mocked, dry bones that breathe, weapons that burn to ash, and warm homes instead of killing. Merchants who learned that beauty without humility ends in the surf. Pharaohs who learned that the Nile needs a maker more than a manager. Shepherds who learned to count lambs and not paychecks. Priests who learned to wear linen and leave sweat at the threshold. A watchman who learned to speak only when fire filled his mouth. The detail of Ezekiel's Gog narrative deserves one more pass for the precision of its aftermath. 7 months of burial to cleanse the land after the invasion falls. Men are employed full-time to search out bones. When a traveler sees a bone, he sets a marker, and burial crews return to enter it in the designated valley. The precision regulates zeal with order. Zeal without order becomes defilement. God's victory produces reverence, not frenzy. The weapons, likely wooden shafts and components, provide 7 years of fuel. Israel does not need to strip forests because the wreckage of the enemy's hardware keeps homes warm. The name of the city and valley mark the event so that later generations do not mythologize it beyond recognition. Memory is curated, not sensationalized. Ezekiel refuses to let victory rewrite reality into legend. He writes it into liturgy instead, a memorial that points back to God's hand and forward to holy living. Ezekiel's temple vision, often reduced to architecture, carries interpersonal ethics in its walkways. The prince may not oppress by seizing people's land, In the old days, a king like Ahab could confiscate Naboth's vineyard with a farce of justice. In the vision to come, that behavior is thrown out with the old rubble. Dispossession breaks covenant, because inheritance in the land is a theological reality, not a real estate arrangement. Scales must be accurate. Ephah and bath measures must align with the sanctuary standard. Honest weight becomes worship. Crooked measurement is idolatry in a new suit. The prophet's patient inches and cubits preach like a courtroom speech. The river's course continues to preach at ground level. It does not heal the swamps and marshes. They are left for salt. Community needs salt for covenant and service. Healing is not a chemical trick that eliminates salt from the world. Healing sets salt back in its right place. Even that line hums with a wisdom that reaches into kitchens and markets and fields. The prophet's practical holiness grinds any lazy assumption that revelation is vague. Revelation in Ezekiel runs on measurements, on water depth, on harvest cycles, on assigned responsibilities for gates and chambers, on the daily bread of a people being rebuilt. Names anchor his message into the long story. Jehoiachin in captivity, Zedekiah's broken oath to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's armies, Hophra's pride, and Amosis's reign, Alexander's engineering, Cyrus's edict, Ezra's readings, and Nehemiah's walls, the Elephantine community of Judean soldiers keeping Passover on an island in the Nile under Persian rule. The web of dates and places and deeds speaks to a reader used to myth and legend without anchorage. Ezekiel refuses that genre. He chooses the harder work of blending fire with footnotes. The prophet's sharp edges never lose their aim to heal. He berates shepherds to protect sheep. He exposes idolatry to clear space for presence. He shocks with allegory to free a conscience trapped in denial. He dismantles national pride to deliver a future that pride could never sustain. He calls out false prophets, not to win rhetoric points, but to keep walls from collapsing on children. He names oppressors to make room for inheritance joy. He tells exiles that the Lord will be a sanctuary in a strange land, so they do not bleed out while waiting. He whispers that a new heart will be given, so they do not settle for an old life, with nicer slogans. From the river of life to a sealed gate, from a throne on wheels to bones in a valley, Ezekiel's scenes capture a God who writes headlines and blueprints at the same time. The presence that once crashed into a mobile throne over the K-bar refuses to be reduced to a museum piece. It moves toward a city whose new name insists on reality, not nostalgia. The Lord is there. That line carries weight even in modern streets, where cracked foundations and bright new towers sit side by side. It carries weight in refugee camps and in sanctuaries rebuilt after fire. It carries weight at gravesides where someone whispers Ezekiel's valley and imagines breath like wind crossing a field. All of Ezekiel's prophecies unfold like a sequence designed to both confront and comfort. The early abominations pulled back a curtain to reveal why temple walls cannot protect corruption. The oracles against nations exposed regional predators and mocked their arrogance. The valley of dry bones rebuilt a people's imagination beyond the rubble of history. The Gog prophecy assured the remnant that the last word does not belong to any northern horde. The temple vision sketched a future where God's presence inhabits a world structured to honor it, not exploit it. The prince eats bread in holiness. The priests wear linen. The people bring honest offerings. Strangers receive inheritance. Rivers heal dead water. The east gate testifies to glory. The name above the gates testifies to truth. Ezekiel's story begins under a foreign sky. It ends under a name that asserts home. Empires shift. Markets rise and fall. Shepherds come and go. The presence outlasts them all. The man who ate a scroll by a canal and lay on his side for hundreds of days taught the exiles a strange and steady secret. A God who left a polluted house can return to a rebuilt heart. A city that broke can be renamed. A people scattered on the wind can be joined stick to stick, bone to bone, soul to soul. A prophet can be silenced by command and then opened to sing. All of that burns in Ezekiel's book, as if penned by a hand that knew both Babylon's dust and heaven's fire.